Why does the government say that they should be separate?
Yeah, it's one of those ones. It's an interesting one because I feel like I've been banging on about this for 4 years in saying that you should be separating SIL and SDA, and that any day now it's going to be enforced.
I mean, they have talked about it for a long time, and it was in the NDIS review that it was again recommended. Do you think we're likely to see it actually legislated?
From a view of people wanting it, absolutely. I think it's an any day sort of thing. There was clearly an appetite. There's clearly been a government appetite when it came down to it months ago to bring it into force. But the first step has been so slow to getting here. We just don't know as to what sort of reform we're going to see coming up with the NDIS and with the NDIS Act in particular. However slowly it might be, we are moving to a phase where there is going to be a need to have that separation. And now it's a question of what form that separation takes.
Every SIL provider knows the challenges: compliance, rosters, claims. But what if you could work smarter, grow faster, and make a bigger impact? Welcome to SILosophy, where we have real conversations about what it takes to succeed in supported independent living. This podcast is powered by Tania Gomez Consulting and Resolve. Let's get into it.
Welcome to SILosophy. Today I'm joined with Josh Byron from SpendAble. Thanks so much for joining me today, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to bring you in today to specifically talk about your top tips for managing money and property in a SIL home. But before we jump into that, can you just give us a little bit of a background into your journey in this space, as well as what SpendAble is?
Yeah, sure. So SpendAble was born out of service provision. We owned and operated a service provider for about 6 years prior to SpendAble starting. So we experienced this problem with client funds and the management of that firsthand. A lot of the services we did was community access groups, camps and stuff. So we had a lot of disconnect with the frontline staff in the sense of the staff weren't coming to office and things like that. So we weren't having that interaction versus, in a SIL where you do come through that kind of common spot. But the challenge that was identified in that organisation was that when staff were supporting clients to pay in the community, it was really, really difficult to keep records of that compliantly and to do so with the appropriate oversight for both the family as well as us as an organisation with the compliance obligations required. So SpendAble was born out of a necessity to solve that problem, and the broader the conversation got, the more we recognised that was a problem that was quite widespread. So what SpendAble is it is exactly that. It's a clients funds management solution for service providers to support clients to compliantly manage their money, but it also acts as an assistive technology product for participants to help them to build their own capacity to handle their money more independently, have a safer way for support workers to access money if they need support to spend, and more than anything, just provide an environment that connects all stakeholders and all supports of a client into one space rather than having a very disconnected method to do so.
Wonderful. I think it's such a great idea. Often financial transparency seems to be a really big problem. So, you talked about staff being remote, but also just that oversight into how things are being spent means that there's this grey area, I suppose, where either purposefully or, unintended, there is the ability there for participants' funds to be misused. How does SpendAble do that better? And why do we need to make sure that we have that kind of transparency?
Yeah, I think we need to start with the context of the reality is that over time there's become this, unwritten, unspoken expectation that when a participant lives in a SIL that provider will be the one to manage their money. And the reality is that isn't a billable service. It's not something that the providers are paid to deliver. It isn't within a scope of service, but it is kind of this peripheral expectation. And what that has led to over time is a lot of providers almost becoming a bit of a treasury for client funds and acting almost as a bank in a way, holding significant amounts of funds on behalf of clients. And naturally there comes a lot of mess that comes with that. And because there isn't, that written process around what that's supposed to look like, because it isn't, I guess, an explicit service. There's just been a lot of, I guess, sticky taping over the years of what those processes and the defaults of that become. And because of that, there's obviously a number of legal perspectives on that. So there's, you've got quality and safeguard expectations, which is around the record keeping that you do, which is what was spent, whose money was spent, who spent it, where it was spent, how much, and receipts and evidence of that. And the record keeping of that is quite cumbersome and quite time consuming. A lot of the time that defaults to quite manual record keeping, relying on frontline staff to do that work. And the reality is, when manual record keeping is in place, like, we're all human, we're going to make mistakes. And if you're in an organization that has, one SIL house with a couple of participants, that might be easy enough to manage. But what we see is that as those programs scale to 10 houses, 30 houses, 50 houses, those processes don't change, but the scale in which that's occurring does at a pretty significant level, and there's a lot of disconnect. On the flip side of things, the way in which that money is then stored is often in a cash tin, in a safe, or similar. And then you've then got this conversation around environmental restraint and restricting a participant's free access to their money. The challenge that we see a lot of is that you can't kind of solve both problems at the same time. If you've got this really strict regime of record keeping that is often very time consuming and not very effective and efficient, you have to have a level of governance and a level of oversight and control over how that money is distributed, which means that at its simplest level, a participant does need to ask permission to use their money, which is, not very dignifying and does restrict an element of choice and control because it slows down that speed of access. On the flip side, if a participant has free access to their money, there's no control, no oversight over how that money is being used and who's interacting with it. Because if a debit card or cash is handed over to someone, you are relying effectively on a complete honesty system to make sure that those records are recorded properly. And if anything does go wrong, it's de-identified, you've missed, by handing over cards and things like that, you're breaching bank rules and things like that. So you're losing a lot of fraud protection. So the problem is often a lot larger than what is potentially seen. And so, what we aim to do is to create an environment where you've got a system that solves both of those problems simultaneously. You're able to accountably keep records without all the significant administration, without removing a participant's access to their money, giving them more access, control, and empowerment to use their money in a way that's supported and supports positive decision-making, increases the speed of which all stakeholders can get access to information, whether that's a parent, a provider, a house manager, the participant themselves, and just overall creates an environment that is, specific to this space. The NDIS is a big enough space that deserves purpose-built tech, and I think that was what was probably missing in this area, was the requirement to find solutions that weren't quite tailor-made and trying to make them fit. It's the exact same reason why, care provider specific CRMs exist and the likes as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so many little gold nuggets in what you just said there. I think I really would like to touch more on the concept of what could go wrong. So what are the risks to the SIL provider in not doing this well? Yeah,
we've got to probably break that down into what are the different methods in which providers traditionally have managed money in the past. And there's probably two kind of core ways, as I mentioned. Like the cash manual written ledger type model is one that's quite common because it's easy to mobilize, it's quick to start.
Yeah.
Because all you need is a piece of paper and a tin from Bunnings and you can pretty much get started, right? Yeah. The things that can go wrong in that area is that you're requiring manual record keeping. So you're relying on completely accurate records with no human error and effectively ledger compliance by staff members who are not trained accountants and I think that's a bit of an unfair expectation on a support worker who's that's not in their job description. It's not what they signed up for, first of all. So you're expecting a lot more of people than they potentially have signed up for, first of all. But the other issue is in the delay of oversight. A lot of the time, if there's a few participants living in a house, most cash checks and cash counts are done at the start of the day and the end of the day, or maybe 3 times a day if you're doing it per shift. It's a lot of time to pass before errors are picked up, and oftentimes by the time an error is picked up at a house level, it's been hours, a receipt's not there, the cash doesn't add up to what the ledger says.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to recover the missing money. If it's not picked up at that point, a finance team member might get all of the ledgers across a number of houses a week later, a fortnight later. The likelihood of recovering or fixing that information is very low. And oftentimes that means that if there's missing funds, the provider has to wear that out of their bottom line. We know that margins are getting tighter in this industry. It's getting harder to create sustainable models. And the reality is a significant amount of SIL providers are not profitable.
Yeah.
So if this is just another thing that's costing money, like it's a pretty important thing to solve for, not to mention the indirect costs of the time that goes into managing that. So what providers will sometimes do is go, right, okay, we're going to find a solution to fix that. We don't want to run on cash anymore. It's too manual. And then that's when, if they might be using a business expense tool or something like that for their office expenses or for their staff spending, and they'll try and make that fit for their clients. The problem with that is that requires you to take a client's personal money and store it in a business environment. You're putting it in a business bank account or a business system. So there's a couple of problems there. One, putting client funds into your business accounts. From an accounting standpoint, there's an argument that actually needs to sit on your balance sheet. You need to, there's an argument that needs to be recorded as income. And then what are the implications of that to you from a tax and financial balance and a balance sheet perspective? But secondary to that, you can't issue a card to a client through a business system, through a business account. So again, you've then got this environmental restraint problem. You're putting a fence between a participant and their money. So you might be able to keep the records, but you're completely disempowering a client's ability to access and use their money effectively. And it's creating more reliance over time because the participants rely exclusively on the staff to be the ones to execute payments for them.
Yeah. It sounds like a big mess, doesn't it? Like when you started talking about the multiple ledgers going to the finance team and them doing that reconciliation, that just sounds like a really big, monumental task. And I guess the implications of all of that is either the SIL provider wears that, as you said, or I guess if that's missing, then you have to report to the commission that it's, a theft potentially, or, do you need to involve police? Do you need to go down all of those investigations of what happened to that money? Obviously, that might depend on the funds of how much is missing. But there's quite a lot of risk there around, the provider has a lot of risk there to minimise, because anything to do with money, obviously, we need to make sure that they're taken quite seriously.
Yeah, and even at a really simple example of that, and if we just look at the example around the absorbing of missing funds, a lot of the time in SIL there will be some kind of service agreement with a contribution agreement for joint costs like your groceries, utilities, things like that. It'll be a fixed cost that is a recurring payment, and that just gets pulled for joint expenses. That's separate to discretionary everyday spending. We're working with a provider that had because of the manual record keeping they were doing, they weren't actually aware that they were overspending their allocations for groceries, for example. And when we dove into the numbers and actually worked through what they'd been doing, they were losing $50,000 a year out of their bottom line that they were overspend. It was a $20 a week per house overspend. Yeah. It's not a significant amount. It doesn't feel like much. So not only were they overspending and having to wear $50,000 out of their bottom line, all of their spending was online groceries. So how does a participant get involved in the decision making around what they're going to eat that week and have an input into the way in which having an input into what they purchase and why they're purchasing it and getting involved in that. So even just something as simple as having a card that a participant has access to that supports good decisions allows you to take that client to the shop, to make a decision, to be involved in their shopping experience, to be the one that's tapping the card. It's little things like that can make such a massive difference. And our goal is always to empower a participant to take as many steps forward as they can towards being as independent as possible. But one step forward is massive progress. It's just about how can we support that participant to take the next step. And the way to not allow a participant to take the next step is to not allow them to have access to their money.
Yeah. So it's a really good point. How does a solution like SpendAble actually build that capacity? Obviously they're having access to it, but other than the access, are you also teaching them skills around money management? Is there budgeting? How involved is it, and what type of what kind of strategies do you have for that empowerment side?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that we're always trying to evolve, and we're always trying to iterate and improve on, and something that we work on with every single one of the providers that we work with is how do we effectively engage and communicate with the participants and their families around like why the provider's taking on something like SpendAble to create a safer, more transparent and more accountable environment to manage client funds. But then secondly, how can that participant get a direct outcome from that as well? And so yeah, as I mentioned, the participant product that we built was actually the first product we built. It wasn't initially, we initially built it as a participant assistive technology before we had a provider platform. Because our logic was, well, we've got a decision to make here. Is the decision to make life easier for our workers, or is it to give the participants a tool that's effectively allowing them to build their capacity so our workers don't even need to be involved? Because that should be the goal, right? It's not the support workers' money. The default shouldn't be how do we make it easier to pay on behalf of. It should be how do we make it as easy as possible to empower someone to pay themselves. And where the gaps were there was in traditional banking products. There was quite a high barrier to entry. A lot of participants didn't even have a bank account. They weren't able to access one. So by being able to provide a solution where they could access a digital payment system meant that they didn't have to rely on cash for the long term. As we know, you can't go to the movies anymore. You can't go to a footy game anymore and pay cash. Like they're all cashless venues. So how do you ensure that someone is included in the activities that they love to do? So that was the first piece. How do we make a digital solution that's accessible? And then secondly, when they're using that digital solution, how do we make sure that supports someone to make good decisions? So all of our platform is designed around removing a lot of the literacy and numeracy requirements and turning it into a consistent behavior, creating a consistent process, whether you're buying a coffee, buying your groceries, paying a bill. It's a consistent process every time, and it's all about it's a very visual approach to paying, and just about ensuring that participant has an ability to pay independently, to pay and to segment their money into different budgets into different budgets and categories, I guess, and allowing for a breadth of capacity to be catered for. So whether someone has the independence to pay independently or does require support to pay, there's a method that can be applied to any participant's circumstances so that they can be involved in their spending.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really a key element. And so your solution started off with that as the primary goal. How then did you move to the provider side of things?
Yeah, so initially having that product, we were then talking with a lot of support coordinators, occupational therapists and the likes about how this could apply to the participants' everyday circumstances. And then I think that natural conversation started to evolve. A lot of the participants we were working with were living in SIL or were looking to move into SIL, so their parents were looking for a solution that allowed that participant to have access to their money because once they moved out of home, the parent wasn't going to be able to manage that for them. And then, so as we started to engage, again, as you engage with the stakeholders within a participant's life, we started having more conversations with providers, and I guess that conversation just became a little bit organic. It was like, right, well, we've got a number of participants that we think could use this. How can we support all of them in one spot? And at that point, it was very much there's an account for a participant, and then there's an account for like a financial guardian or parent to oversee that. And so it was just about then evolving the product and allowing an organisation to be created effectively so that there was a common space for a provider to oversee. And that was when we started to look at, well, what could this ecosystem approach look like so that a participant could be central to the system, but then their support workers could be connected to their money securely, a parent, a trustee and guardian, the support providers that provide them with the different supports, and people could just have access to the information and funds that they needed to. It's having a bit of a least access approach, but just then making sure that anyone that could access the money, it was secure and it was accountable. We liken it to, you know, the red light camera, right? Like even if someone does have access to money, if the red light camera is there, you're probably not going to run the red light, and that's the same kind of thing. That it just reduces the likelihood and disincentivizes, you know, malicious activity. The reality is that the vast majority of people are not out to do anything malicious, but therefore it then just allows you to very quickly pick up any you know, completely honest mistakes and rectify them so that there aren't, you know, ramifications down the line as well.
Yeah. What would your best advice be to a new SIL provider trying to navigate how to manage money for the first time?
Yeah, I think that, and this is probably not just within client funds, but I think there's probably a consensus of you want to move fast. You want to move fast to get things set up and operate, obviously, but there's probably some things that if you kick the can down the road, it just becomes a bigger problem down the road. And I think the ability to invest in technology across your processes is really important. It may not seem like something that's overly necessary when you've just got one participant in one house, for example, but you know, I'm sure any provider doing SIL has probably experienced the same thing when they first started provision in the first place. They might have done their rosters on an Excel spreadsheet and then it got out of hand at some point. You implement a software, you invest in that, and I think everyone would resonate with the pain of having to undo those processes. You've almost got to take 5 steps back to take the step forward. So I would just say that a lot of people look at the direct costs associated with investing in technology, but often disregard the indirect costs and then the savings associated with that as well. If it's taking 5 minutes per participant per shift to record what money had been spent at the end of a shift, and it's taking 5 minutes for a support worker to check out the money at the start of a shift, and then it's taking 20 minutes at the end of a shift for a house manager to oversee that, and it's taking an hour every fortnight for the finance person to oversee and manage all the reconciliation, and then you extrapolate that across 3 participants a house, across 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 houses. All of a sudden you've got literal millions of dollars of time that is being invested that is non-billable time. Yeah. And I then just ask, you know, if you've got $50,000 worth of time that you're using, even if it's at a smaller scale on this non-billable work, that could be either redeployed into support, which then is commercially a greater outcome as a provider, builds more commercial sustainability into operations, but then ultimately provides better outcomes and more time into actually supporting the client achieve their goals and receive the support that they need. Yeah. You know, I think there's a lot of you know, commercial sensibility in that, but then there's a lot of things that, you know, money can't buy as well, which is just the outcomes for the client, and then naturally then, you know, the brand outcomes for you and the reputation side of things. You become a better provider because you can provide better care with more time investment into those services. Yeah.
It's all about working smarter and not harder, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like it's trying to leverage technology wherever you can to reduce those overheads, streamline your processes, and make sure that you can stay within the profit margins that you have, actually make a profit as a business, or you know, at least not lose money as a business. And setting up these systems is a way that you can then sustainably scale that model.
Yeah, well, because that's the thing. I think especially in the care space and in for purpose spaces, the conversation around making a profit and generating revenue can be a little bit taboo. But I think the reality is like we've got to acknowledge the conversation, because if you can't create a sustainable business, you can't deliver support. Yeah. So it's in your best interest not only for the outcome of your business, but for the people that you support as well. Like that having that consistency and that stability and support is important. And if technology can play a role in that, and it will play a role in that, it's the reality. It's how the world's moving to. And as I mentioned, at the most simple level, take everything else, take all of the other variables we've spoken about today off the table. Yeah. If you can't pay with cash somewhere because it's not accepted and you're exclusively operating in cash, how does that participant access the things that they love to do?
Yeah.
And if you're not providing them with an alternative option that is compliant and that is supporting them to be the one making the payment, like what does that do for the participants' outcomes?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it as well. It's almost then an element of future-proofing, future-proofing the business so that when we do become a cashless society, they actually have those skills. And at that point, you're not going to be able to have the cash tin from Bunnings. You're actually going to have something like this in place. I suppose what you alluded to there is that the alternative option would be then to set up a business card, but then you have those issues around fraud protection that you were talking about as well, and also you're adding participants' money into your P&L, or it's staying under other ways of leveraging to be able to get a ATM card or a FPOS card.
Yeah, you're just creating different problems. You're not solving, you might be solving one, but you're just creating another. And I think the reality is that and again, going back to the concept of this isn't a billable service, often that means that it does fall down the priority list of things to worry about. But anything that directly involves the property or the money or anything to do with the outcomes of your client, if you cut corners, the only person that loses is the client. The only person that loses is the participant, because, if there's a compliance breach, that's obviously not ideal. It's not what we want, but, the participant is impacted far more by, the inability to service them effectively and through breaching compliance or whatever it is than you are by having to go through that audit process and have cop a fine or whatever the implication of that is. Any implication to you as a business is significantly larger for the client.
Yeah.
When we look at it in reality.
And it's also just avoidable as well. Like
Exactly.
There's just a whole lot of drama for no reason at all. So we talked a little bit around technology and leveraging technology. What developments do you see in the future for tools like SpendAble or other tools in the SIL space that are opportunities for technology to be leveraged to make life easier for SIL providers, and then obviously that impacts the quality of care for participants?
Yeah, we're really fortunate we have some really, really good relationships with a number of technology providers in the care space across disability, across aged care, child and family services, etc. And the thing that's really exciting is that there's such a massive amount of development being done an innovation in the space to improve outcomes for providers and for participants as well. I obviously can't speak to product roadmaps of other businesses, but we're really excited for what's on the horizon for us. We're always looking to improve both interfaces to create a common experience where we're in the middle of building a solution that's going to allow providers to manage rent, utility, joint expenses and things like that through our platform. So there's one source of truth for all payments to do with anything to do with clients and things like that, which is going to be a pretty exciting space to be in, and a few other really cool developments like that. And all of these developments come on the back of feedback and conversations with our clients, and making sure that it is really customer led. So things like that are going to be really exciting for 2025 and beyond. And yeah, it's just about how do we make the experiences as simple as possible, as valuable as possible, and to generate as much leverage and value as possible.
Yeah, amazing. So we've covered quite a lot today. We've talked about the importance of financial transparency. We've talked about the common issues in how money is being managed with SIL at the moment. We've talked about strategies for empowering participants and a little bit about other innovations in the space. Is there anything else that you think is important that we talk about today when it comes to managing money in SIL homes?
I think that when you strip everything back and go, what is going to be in the best interest of the participant, their life and their outcomes, it is impossible to come to an answer that involves cutting corners. Like, if you really look at a cash process, if you look at using a business expense solution that you can't give them access to, it is there is no way to justify how that is in the best interest of the client. And now, I'm not saying that everyone has to use SpendAble. Like that's, you're never gonna, no solution is gonna be right for everyone, and that's okay. I'm just saying that, there's opportunities to do more for clients and to give them the best opportunities, because we just want to work towards a world where the client doesn't need provider intervention, because we want to get to a space, we see a world where there's a space where the participant has the tools and has the technology at their disposal to support them as much as possible, and not require the level of intervention that exists now. And because for the client it's more empowerment, for the provider it's less non-billable and work that is not within a service remit as well. So small steps, but it's just about making sure that we are working towards that moving forward.
Wonderful. If someone wants to get in touch with you and learn more about SpendAble, how can they do that?
Absolutely. Spendable.com.au is our website. Feel free to reach out via our contact form. If you want to have a look at the product, you can book in a time to do so. Josh Byron on LinkedIn. If you want to have a direct conversation, I'm more than happy to chat, and always love talking about anything in this space. So always up for just a conversation, and love to hear people's thoughts and input. Providers are the best people to hear about how we can continue to improve our product. They're the ones that are out, operating every single day, and they're the ones that are keeping up the most. And same thing with clients. We love to hear from participants directly about what their needs look like, and to support their financial independence as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much for
That's a
joining us
wrap
today. That was
on
awesome.
this episode of SILosophy. If this resonated with you, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone in the SIL space who really needs to hear this. Don't forget to connect with Tania Gomez Consulting on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for more resources, conversations, and support to help you grow your impact. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep making a difference.